Treble River by Betsy Byers, Chapter 9, The Rapids. Dewey kept his eyes on the shores of the river. He was afraid that Indians, if they were in the area, would be drawn by the sounds of gunfire. In the moonlight, he occasionally saw the wolves slinking on the shore, but it did not trouble him. As long as he kept the raft in the center of the river, he and his grandma would be safe from them. He pulled the raft closer to the far bank. "Keep it steady, boy," his grandma said. "Ain't no time to be upsetting now that we're almost there. No. Charlie had given up growling at the wolves and now sat uneasily by Grandma's feet. The blanket had been abandoned in the rush for the raft, and now he had nothing to lie on. The water licking between the logs made him uneasy. He stuck his cold nose up into Grandma's hand. "You worthless critter," she said. "You think I got nothing better to do than hold your nose?" Still, she patted his head before she withdrew her hand. "I reckon we'll all be glad to see friendly faces, the dog too." "He ain't a bad dog, Grandma. It was him that scared the Indian off back at the cabin." "I know," she said, softening. Then, "only he just makes such a nuisance of himself. Look at him, sitting there, making himself comfortable on the hem of my skirt, worthless critter." Charlie looked up, licked at her with his long tongue, and wiggled closer. Although she would not admit it, the warmth of the dog felt good against her legs, and she did not make him move. "Maybe by now everything's gone wrong that can," Dewey said hopefully. "Maybe." "There's lots of things that could go wrong out here. More than back in Ohio," Dewey said. "Indians and wolves, everything." "It ain't only out here. The year I was 5 years old, now that was a year for things going wrong. I heard my ma tell it again and again. First the river flooded. Then there was hailstones, big as nuts, that beat down all the crops. Then come earthquakes that shook the whole house. Chimneys just fell right off our house in the middle of one night. There were gray squirrels, thousands of them, coming up through the country like the wind and strange lights in the sky. It was a fearful time," my ma said. "Folks thought it was the end of the world. Only here we are, and we're still going on." An island loomed ahead of them, a flat piece of land strewn with old timber and matted growth. The raft touched on the edge of the island, then swung slowly around and continued sideways down the river. Quickly, Dewey straightened it. "Don't nothing come easy nowhere," Grandma said. "I reckon." Now they fell silent. Only the sound of Dewey's oars dipped into the water broke the silence. Dewey had no idea of the time. The moon was dropping in the sky, and there were no morning sounds, and he knew daylight was still hours away. He bent to reach under the raft, feeling the strips of hide. Some of them had begun to fray because of the constant rubbing of the logs, but he thought there was no danger. The raft would see them through. His grandma began to hum, then sang softly in her high voice, 13 years I traveled, 13 years I roamed, 13 years I traveled, and now I'm going home." When he was younger, she would sing to him every night before he fell asleep. He had thought her voice was beautiful as a silver bell, and then one morning he had said impatiently, "I ain't a baby no more, Grandma. You don't have to sing to me." And she had not sung again. Now, as they drifted down the river for the first time in years, he heard her voice again. Her voice was older, thinner, but painfully familiar as she sang the song of a weary traveler far from home. He sang with her on the last chorus. "No more will I travel, no more will I roam, no more will I travel, for I'm going home." Their singing was quiet, and they finished. They fell silent again, each lost in thought. Dewey looked at his grandma's back, so straight and proud, at the white-laced bonnet which hung on the back of the chair. Removing her bonnet had been the only concession to the difficulties of this trip. He shifted position and began to rub some of the stiffness out of his arms. His bare feet were cold against the wet logs, and suddenly he wanted to be in Hunter City so badly that his knees began to tremble. He dipped his oar deep into the water to speed their progress. By dawn, they were gaining speed again. The river had straightened, and the water, as if released from its confining path, rushed toward its goal, Big River. "Maybe you better slow us down, boy," Grandma said. It was the first time she had spoken in hours, though she had not been asleep. It ain't that I don't want to get there as fast as you do. Yes'm, I will. It's just that I don't want to get upset." "I'll slow her down." He plunged his oar into the water, bracing himself, and waited for the raft to slow. But this seemed to have no effect. The raft traveled on the water as if borne by a billowing sail. "Slow her down, boy." Grandma jabbed her cane into the air. "Now, boy." "I am," he said. Again he swept the oar against the current and added in a low voice, "As much as I can." She glanced back at him, and he tried not to show his concern. We'll slow up in a bit, Grandma. If we don't, I'll stop when we get up beyond them bluffs. The river had swung to the east, and the sun was shining directly into his eyes. He squinted and lifted his hand to shade them. Ahead, on either side of the river, bluffs rose tall and rocky. Dewey thought briefly of landing the rafts, but the shore was ragged with boulders. He feared the jolt against one of the enormous rocks would burst the strips of hide, now straining to hold the logs together. The rocks he glimpsed beneath the water were round, but a crash against one of them, now that their speed had increased, would tear the raft to pieces. Perhaps the raft will slow itself when we round the bend yonder, Grandma said. She took her cane, sat it across her lap, and held it along with the handle of her satchel in both hands. I'll keep working, though, Dewey said, just in case it don't. He thrust his oar into the river, and rushing water rippled around it, creating a wake. We're really moving, he said. What, boy? She shouted over the noise of the water. Nothing. What'd you say? I said we're really moving. Well, you didn't need to tell me that. She looked uneasily at the churning water. Then she said slowly, I ain't much used to water. The tone of her voice and her expression concerned him, and he began to work feverishly to send the raft to the shore. The river had narrowed. The shore was close on either side, but try as he could not move the raft from the rush of the current. All his paddling was to no avail. He stopped abruptly, the wet oar against his chest, and looked ahead. There, if anywhere, lay his hope. Perhaps as they rounded the bend, he thought, the long stretch of lazy river would greet them. Then they would slow and sail smoothly on to Hunter City. Are we slowing any, boy? She asked. No, He gasped as the raft tipped in the rough currents. The water was now white with foam, and it rose and fell like a billowing silk, bearing them swiftly toward the bluffs. Maybe around the bend, his grandma shouted, again as if she hoped to make it true by saying it over and over. Then neither of them spoke. They waited, Grandma in her chair leaning forward tensely. Dewey gripped in his oar. Charlie, on his feet now, whined and shifted unsteadily behind Grandma's chair. They listened intently without moving. So it was then that they heard the rapids before they saw them. It was a wild noise that filled the air like the drone of a million insects. What is that, boy? Grandma shouted. He did not answer, for both of them knew. Dewey watched wide-eyed as the little raft, unbelievably frail in the tempestuous water, swept around the bend in the river. The water rippled sideways like the flank of a giant horse trying to rid itself of a fly. Then Dewey gasped, and he heard his grandma scream. There, stretching below them, were the rapids. Through a treacherous crack in the bluffs, it was as if the bluffs had been pulled apart like a ripe fruit. The water ran, dashing against rocks, throwing spray high into the air. It slipped over wide, even boulders, then turned dangerously green in swirling pools. Then it divided around a boulder as big as a cabin and rushed out of sight. Get down, boy, his grandma cried. He heard her when he was already on his knees, thrown by the force of the first waterfall. He slung one arm around Grandma and then crouched under his grandma's rocker, his other arm anchoring the chair to the raft. He felt them slipping down another fall, sliding easily, and then the raft struck flat on the water, and Dewey's face crashed into the logs with such force that he saw a splash of black. He screamed, tasted blood, and screamed again. Beneath his arms, Charlie struggled to get free. He braced, tried to pull himself from Dewey's grasp, using his hind feet to force himself backward. No, Dewey screamed, no! And he held him by the neck in the crook of his arm. The dog choked, struggled, and then was still. Water washed over Dewey, drenched him, and he looked up in time to watch them sweep to the left of the huge boulder. He ducked his head and felt the water spray again, cold and powerful as the rocks against his back. They plunged, turned twice, and fell as if they were dropping to the center of the earth. Dewey was in the air for a moment, and then they struck the water. The rocking chair hit him on the shoulder. Grandma, he cried. Water was in his mouth, his eyes, and he thought they had plunged under the water and were lost. He swallowed the icy water and sucked it in his nose and gasped for breath. Then, abruptly, it was over. It was like coming out of a nightmare, for they all came through the dark shadows of the bluffs into the early morning sunlight. The sun turned the rippling water golden, and then the river widened to fill the broad valley beyond. Dewey lifted his head. The dog, his fur flattened over his body, strained to be free. Dewey released him, and Charlie looked around. ready to leap for safety, then found to his surprise that he was safe. The water was smooth now, unhurried, and the only faint sound of the rapids behind to remind them of their recent danger. "Grandma?" Dewey said. There was no answer. "Grandma!" He straightened and raised himself to one knee. "Grandma!" "I'm still here, boy," she said in a voice that sounded small and distant. "Are you all right?" He looked at her. Her clothes were plastered against her thin body. Her hair, always so neatly bound behind her head, now hung in wet wisps. The bonnet she had guarded so carefully hung like a limp rag behind her. But her satchel, wet and flattened over the objects it contained, was still held securely in her lap. Suddenly, Dewey got to his feet. He put one hand to his eyes to shield them from the sun. "Grandma! Grandma!" He covered her thin shoulders with his hand. "Grandma, yonder's Hunter City."